When I go around the country talking about direct action, I often get the question, what exactly is direct action? And you hear all sorts of answers. Some people say it's breaking the law to free animals. Some people say it's smashing windows and gluing locks. Some people say it's directly rescuing animals from any place of violence. But I have an answer that's just two short words. But I want to come back to that later. First, I want to tell a story. 40 years ago, one of my law professors, a constitutional law scholar at the University of Chicago, came to school as a young, long-haired hippie, fresh off the civil rights movement. And this young law professor, when he came to this school, had a student who came to him and asked him, "Jeff, I want to start a gay rights organization." And what do you think the professor, Jeff, what do you think his response was? Well, his response was this: gay rights? That sounds like a criminal conspiracy. Now remember, this was in a day and age when if you were gay and out, your parents would lock you up in an institution and throw away the key. But within a few decades, so much has changed. Over 60% of people now say they support LGBT equality. Gay pride is one of the biggest celebrations in the world. And the Supreme Court of the United States just enshrined marriage equality as a constitutional right. The struggle for equality is far from over, but in 40 years, we went from a criminal conspiracy to a constitutional right. And how did that happen? Let me show you how. 40 years of messy, turbulent, and confrontational action just like this. The idea behind actions like this was quite simple. We can't win if no one is talking. So let's cry out from every city, from every neighborhood, and yes, every street corner, until the world finally starts to talk. This was what the gay rights movement called direct action. But direct action also included so much more. Here are some examples from ACT UP's website. Direct action can be talking to friends and family, writing a letter to the editor. This is an actual example. Organizing a gay Tupperware party. The key thing that tied all these forms of action together, challenging rather than accommodating injustice. But it's not just the gay rights movement that use this definition of direct action. Consider this. The Oxford English Dictionary, which is usually deemed the standard for the English language, defines direct action as, quote, the use of strikes, demonstrations, or other public forms of protest, rather than negotiation to achieve one's demands. The Martin Luther King Jr. Center defines direct action as, quote, the strategic use of non-violent tactics to bring an oppressive party into dialogue. Direct action is a moral force to counter injustice, end quote. Why have historical movements used these definitions for direct action? Well, because they understood the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, when we're dealing with systems of violence and repression, is not just an isolated case of abuse here or there that you can solve by gluing some locks or smashing some windows. The root of the problem is cultural, political, systemic, and yes, moral. And the only way to solve a moral problem is to use moral force. So to answer the question, what is direct action? Direct action is moral force. Direct action is challenging rather than accommodating injustice. Now this brings me to my second point. Direct action, as I have defined it, is absolutely vital to a movement's success. Because sometimes a system is so corrupt, so violent, and so evil that there is no point in trying to reform it from the inside. We have to use moral force to bring the entire system down. Let me illustrate. This is Emmeline Pankhurst, the activist who is more responsible for women's suffrage than anyone in the history of human civilization. Emmeline was named by Time Magazine as one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century. But she wasn't successful from the start. Let me tell a story. The year is 1905. Through nearly 10 years of education and lobbying, 10 years of working within the system, Emmeline has managed to get a single member of parliament, just a single member, to present a bill for women's suffrage. So the guy gets up at the podium and presents the bill. And Emmeline and her friends are literally shaking with anticipation. They wait for the response. And the response was, who can guess it? Well, the response was laughter. One by one, the members of parliament got in front of the entire legislature and told offensive jokes about women. They literally laughed Emmeline out of the building. That night, Emmeline and her daughters wiped away their tears and decided that they had had enough. They decided to take direct action. They put together a plan to disrupt a gathering of one of the largest political parties in Britain. A few women would sneak into the crowd with banners hidden under their dresses. At a key moment, they would unveil their banners, jump onto chairs, and shout that women deserve the right to vote. Emmeline's daughter, Christabel, decided she would intentionally spit on a police officer who came to drag her out. She did this, she planned to do this, knowing that spitting on an officer was a technical offense that required arrest. Now, there were fierce debates within the group about this plan. Some said that it was too confrontational, too rude, or even ridiculous. But Emmeline told everybody, being nice has gotten us nowhere. It's time to take a stand. And that's exactly what they did. They pulled the plan off without hitch. The women were dragged out of the meeting, and Emmeline's daughter spat on an officer, and she was placed in jail. But even though they were condemned by many across Britain, a funny thing happened. No one in the entire nation could stop talking about women's rights. And because people began to talk, they began to realize the deep inconsistencies in the way society viewed women. We trusted women with the lives of our children, but we couldn't trust them to vote? More and more activists started taking disruptive action. And before long, Emmeline and her friends had a movement. 10 years later, that movement won. But just as important, they had inspired a cascade of movements that crossed the globe, as dozens of nations followed the Pankhursts on the path to liberation. And it all started with a volley of spit that shook the world. And this is the key reason why direct action is vital, because it works. Political scientists talk about three types of activism. There's contained activism, working within the system, such as lobbying or education. And the problem with contained activism is that no one pays any attention. Second, there's violence. And while violence gets plenty of attention, you lose the moral high ground. Non-violent direct action is a third form, and it is the sweet spot. It has been described by Professor Sidney Tarrow as, quote, the strongest weapon of social movements, because it generates attention, it broadens the circle of debate, and it inspires participation in action. In fact, political scientist Erica Chenoweth has what she calls the rule of 3.5%. Chenoweth has studied hundreds of movements through history, and what she has found is that when it comes to nonviolent direct action, you don't need a majority. You don't even need a large minority. All you need is 3.5% of the population engage in sustained nonviolent direct action, and you will win every single time. And that brings me to my next point. A movement of direct action for animals is possible. People often say, okay, maybe those tactics worked for Emmeline Pankhurst, for Gandhi, for King. But those were people. And we're talking about animals here. Different issue, different tactics. Well, there was another movement that people said couldn't happen. the movement to resist authoritarian rule in the Middle East. Experts said it was impossible, that the dictators controlled all the wealth, that the people were too complacent, and the culture too conformist. Stanford University even published a book about the durability of dictatorships in the Arab world. And for 50 years, the experts were right. But then, in 2010, they were wrong. One man in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, lit himself on fire to protest tyranny in his nation. But the flame he lit upended the politics of 17 different countries. It toppled dictatorships that many thought were unbreakable. And most important, it inspired ordinary people to speak out when for nearly a century they had been trapped in a conspiracy of silence. I'm here to say to the critics who say that animal rights is different. Animal rights is too tough. Animal rights is too hard. Critics, you are wrong. But don't listen to me. Let's look at the numbers. A Gallup poll was released just a few weeks ago showing that 32% of the American public believes that animals should have, quote, the same rights as people. Now let's look back historically. 32% is 10% more than the number of people who believed in gay rights 20 years ago. 32% is 25% more than the number who believed in racial equality in 1958, before the Civil Rights Movement. So when we say that the world will never change, we are simply suffering from a fallacy that one Harvard psychologist calls, quote, the end of the history fallacy. Because history never ends. It grows, it evolves, and it changes. And the question we have before us is not whether change will happen, but what change will happen. And the answer to that question depends on each of us. So I want all of us to do a little exercise right now. Get out your smartphones, your notebooks, or anything you can write on. And I want you to think of all the people you know, all your friends, your family, your coworkers, anyone you've talked to in recent history. And I want us together to spend the next 30 seconds thinking of 3 of those people, just 3 of those people, that we can get active for animals. So let's do this together. Pause the video if necessary. So I want you to now look at those 3 names. And I want you to remember the rule of 3.5% that we just learned. Now, the average person on this planet has about 100 relationships. Each of you probably has 100 people you know. So look down at your list and tell yourself, if I can get these 3 people to get active for animals, then 4 out of the 100 people that I know, 4 out of the 100 people in my social network, in my community, would be active for animals. And that means 4% of the people in my community are now active for animals. And if we can all convince 3 people, including ourselves, to take nonviolent direct action for animals, then we have hit the 4%, the 3.5% threshold. This is a DXE challenge. Can each of us get our friends, our family members, our coworkers, our loved ones active for animals? And if we can meet the DXE challenge, we are guaranteed to change the world. And that brings me to my last point. If you don't believe, after all this history, after all this science, that a mass movement of nonviolent direct action for animals is possible, then I'm going to prove you wrong. Because it is already happening. From China, where I met with kids last month who are blocking dog slaughterhouse trucks on the streets and rescuing puppies from a living hell, to Turkey, where DXE activists are streaming into grocery stores and restaurants and slaughterhouses with a message of animal rights, to this very space today, where activists gather every week to fight for animal rights in the San Francisco Bay Area. All you have to do is open your eyes, and you'll see direct action is already everywhere. And with direct action, we will change the world. So I want to leave you with the 10 words that I left people at the Animal Rights Conference. And those 10 words are this: find your voice, find some friends, and fight like hell. Thank you.